The Queer Potentiality of Ernst Tristan Kurtzahn's Weimar Tarot. An early, if not perhaps the first 20th century book conceptualized specifically for the German reading public dedicated to tarot was published in the Weimar era. And here, just a quick aside, the person I'm going to be talking about was very much influenced by some of the figures we heard about already, including Lévy and Etea, and so the French tradition very much figures prominently in Kurtzahn's own work. But Kurtzahn really wanted to activate a full theory of tarot specifically for the German public, which I think differs slightly from some of the previous projects. There have been translations of previous French books on tarot in German, but for Kurtzahn, those don't quite register as projects, and he wanted to kind of legitimize his own practice, and that's why he kind of called his own work and self-declared it the first book of tarot in German. Written by this occultist Ernst Tristan Kurtzahn, der Tarot, die kabbalistische Methode der Zukunftsforschung als Schlüssel zum Okkultismus, or the Tarot, the Kabbalistic method to study the future as key for occult practice, was published in 1920. It offered an extensive introduction to and an analysis of the symbolic orders underpinning the practice. With the book, Kurtzahn wanted to offer an authoritative guide to tarot's esoteric uses, situating the practice in what he described as a substantial history dating from the pre-Christian era and across continents to its occultist use as he imagined it during his lifetime. Readers of the book could not only learn about tarot's mystical dimensions, but would also become equipped to participate in the practice. The appendix, and you'll recognize some of the iconography which he borrowed from previous decks. The appendix to the tarot contained 9 sheets on which the tarot cards Kurtzahn designed were printed, displaying 3 cards per row and 3 rows per sheet. These could be cut out, or a ready-made printed deck could be purchased directly from the book's publisher, the Thales Verlag, later Richard Hummel Verlag, in Leipzig. The Weimar era was an ideal time and context for Kurtzahn's book and deck. The rise of the German occult in the 1890s onward, with a particular spike in popularity in the aftermath of World War I, is associated with a search for meaning in a world in which social institutions grew too frail to account for the complexities underpinning precarious life. Priska Pütlik's work on the influence of the occult on modernist literature has detailed how the 19th century revival of occult practices took place at a time when other grand systems tasked with exploring. The period of roughly 1890 to 1933 in a German context, which forms a peak in what the German intellectual Jürgen Habermas casts as the era of scientific rationalization of society, was also an era during which the shortcomings of what humanity had learned about the world became very palpable for people. In her study, Pütlik foregrounds the invention of the X-ray, for instance, and related technologies as examples that pointed to dynamics invisible to the human eye. Such inventions cast the limitation of human capacities to apprehend fully and understand worldly phenomena in sharp relief. Particularly in the aftermath of the devastation of World War I, which exasperated the existing epistemic anxieties which Pütlik highlights, the occult helped people to respond to epistemic crises through means that reach beyond those of the failing established social orders and their attendant knowledge practices. Turning to Kurtzahn's tarot, which is one specific mode of occult practice, thus emerged as a form through which people could consider what better world could be possible at a time of radical transformation of private and public life precipitated by the formation of Germany's First Republic. Kurtzahn's book and deck were not intentionally designed for queer people. And thus far, I have not been able to document queer people reading the book or using the cards during the Weimar era. But there's no doubt that they did. Woldemar von Uxküll, who published his own book of tarot in Germany in 1922, in no small part because of a rise in interest in the topic generated by figures like Kurtzahn, was queer and attests to a link between queer people and tarot in the Weimar era. Moreover, Nathan Snaza's work on occult practices such as tarot has established the importance of generative knowledge customs in contemporary queer feminist circles. To me, the divinatory practices Kurtzahn advances constitute a precursor to the subsequent popularity of tarot among queer people across the 20th and 21st centuries. Finally, by the time Kurtzahn published his book and deck, the affinity between queer life and occult practice, broadly speaking, had not only been established, but was also topic for early 20th century queer German media culture. The work of Hans Freimark, who counts among the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld's early collaborators, is a case in point. In 1909, he published a book titled Okkultismus und Sexualität, or The Occult and Sexuality, in which he theorized how queer people's heightened senses required to navigate a world hostile to them made them predisposed to esoteric practices of gleaning information from the beyond. Freimark noted that queer occult practitioners were an important resource to understand queer relational practice historically and also during his own time. However, occult practices such as tarot, because of their situational and private nature, do not leave much evidence in their wake. As evidentiary acts of esoteric knowledge practice, tarot readings are ephemeral phenomena. Consequently, there might be evidence of tarot's existence in the 1920s through the availability of Kurtzahn's book and deck in libraries, but the staging of a reading itself does not leave a trace in the same way a printed book does. Precisely because of their ephemeral nature, a quality of evidentiary practice that Jose Esteban Munoz has described as, I quote, profoundly queer in light of its inability to count as proper proof, end quote, tarot readings index alternative structures of sense-making during the Weimar era. Tarot's epistemic procedures could provide access to weird knowledge, estranged by dominant and normative knowledge systems, which categorically share an affinity with how some queer people understand their relation to the world around them. For the purpose of my study today, particularly my focus on Kurtzahn, tarot's visual practice pertains to the primary means by which audiences engage with tarot's sign system. Tarot cards prompt their deck users to study the signs encoded on their surface for meaning. The search itself, in turn, becomes a means for deck users to reach a state in which they might sense information from beyond the immediately observable material realm. Moreover, the queer potentiality of Kurtzahn's project lies embedded within the very structure of both the book as well as the cards. Particularly, the project's symbolic order is an important site for an analysis of the visual engagement the cards prompt by way of apprehending a trace of Weimar Tarot's ephemeral queer practice. Such an analysis accounts for Kurtzahn's rigid, and I'll speak to that in just a moment, and prescriptivist set of guidelines on how to use the cards. The project's queer qualities indeed feel strongest in the tension between the card's visual style and Kurtzahn's discursive rigidity. The card's visual system indeed invites an associative engagement that is capacious enough to hold space for queer experiences. As such, Weimar users of Kurtzahn's tarot would be able to appropriate the cards for their own needs through the generosity the visual system affords them. Following the work of Sarah Ahmed, whom I know some of you know, this type of use can be described as queer in that an object, in this case a tarot deck, is used, and I quote Sarah Ahmed here, for a purpose that is very different from that which was originally intended, end quote. In interacting with Kurtzahn's study long enough to grasp some common features of tarot reading, and then turning to the card's visual style for guidance in order to glean information from within them, any user of the book or the deck could engage with it on their own terms. The card's visuality indeed prompts readers to dream up worlds and ideas not yet available, but conceivable through tarot's fabulation technology. In departing from received and standardizing systems to understand the world, and I think here both the Enlightenment empiricism, and I'll be glad to speak a little bit more to that point. I've left that out of the presentation for the respect of the time limit. So here both the Enlightenment empiricism and Kurtzahn's prescriptivism, tarot's queer epistemologies can orientate those pursuing a reading by placing them on a queer path. This path is characterized by tentative, incomplete insights that encourage readers to fill in the blanks of a given reading, giving themselves over to the fantasy of self-analysis on semi-systematic, yet mystical, visual terms. In the early years of the Republic, when experimentation with social formations and cultural expression helped give rise to an aura of possibility and transformation that led to the emboldening of early queer rights organizing in the Weimar era, the tarot's generative epistemologies could take place alongside other promising Weimar cultural practices that became very infamous for their queer potentiality in queer history. In each tradition, tarot's visual structures are central for the engagement practices it elicits from its users. The same is true for Kurtzahn's deck. Although he developed the cards according to his own visual style, so he claims, but I'll give you some examples, and you'll notice a lot of similarities between his work and the previous one. Each resembles the very common a model of 78 cards, total divided into 22 major arcana and 56 minor arcana. And this is the French influence of his work. The visual qualities underpinning this model abide by a type of generative symbolism with some recognizable figures and objects aligned in such a way so as to inspire association from the reader. To fabulate from within a tarot reading means to establish patterns between symbols as these might come to bear on any given reading situation and the life histories of those involved in it. The first three cards of Kurtzahn's deck lend themselves very well to explicate this. So the Gaukler, or the magician, die Hohe Priesterin, so the high priestess, and die Kaiserin, or the empress, contain caricatured figures representing in abstract fashion an element associated with the title of the card. The magician is a bearded man interacting with various magical items. The priestess carries a staff and faces a snake, and the empress is an angelic figure seated on a throne. Again, very similar, very familiar iconography to some of the things that you might have already heard today. When reading tarot, these symbols become the first and main mode for fabulation. A card's given illustration certainly pertains to a set of principles Kurtzahn expounded in a book. The tarot reader in this model is supposed to reconcile the illustration on a given card with the information from the book and the given situational conditions for each reading, thereby generating insights on any given subject matter. But the visual information encoded in the cards is always the starting point in every reading, dictating the remaining sense-making procedures in tarot's media operations. The fragmentariness of a visual sign captured in any given card variously interacts with the lived experience of the person seeking the reading and forms a multidirectional dialectic on the basis of which the reader can glean insights about the person and potentially their future. Of note is that Kurtzahn's Der Tarot maintains in its form of address to readers, as well as its relation to other practitioners of tarot, an often condescending relation that is forcefully prescriptive in nature. To this end, he dismisses what he calls common fortune tellers, and I think we've heard a little bit of this sort of elitism structure.
Ervin, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Are you supposed we've only seen your first slide. It hasn't moved. Are there supposed to be?
Yes, there are others.
There would be.
Thank you. Thank you for let's try this again.
Yeah, because
Does this show up on your end?
it's still the first one. It's still just the one.
Oh, I am so listen, friends, I should have said this. I returned back to the title. Because I don't want you to be stuck on these. Is this what has been happening?
We saw that, but we keep
This
going.
is my pausing slide.
Yeah, okay. This is all we're seeing. So I just wanted to make sure that because you were describing things as if we should be seeing them, but we're fine.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, good.
Thank
All
you.
right. Just wanted to make sure.
I appreciate that. I'm trying to control a little too much because last time I got in a little trouble. I brought in too many visual materials last
Don't
time.
worry. No,
Maybe.
no, carry on. Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to
No,
make.
no, it's all right. I might have over-policed myself. I should have brought more. You all seem
Yeah,
visually
we like
intrigued.
pictures. Okay, go ahead. Carry on.
Thanks for that. No, it's all right. Um, we're talking about the condescension. Yeah. He's very condescending. To this end, Kurtzahn dismisses what he calls common fortune tellers pursuing tarot commercially, charging that they fraudulently turn to the practice with what he calls unedle motive or ignoble motives. The authority with which he writes the book on tarot draws its force from a careful study of esoteric practices from across languages and traditions. This work constitutes vast knowledge that Kurtzahn believed to be a prerequisite for anyone interested in wielding tarot effectively. Moreover, while the individual chapters of the book give the text a flair of a handbook that suggests practicality, he indeed wanted, and I think he really wanted the book to actually be used and reused as a reference work. But the extreme details encoded in its pages that oftentimes lack explication despite the extensive textual accompaniment of the images discourage intimate engagement with the material. I'll just give you one example, and I'll be glad to say more about this in the Q&A. At times, Kurtzahn's own esoteric mysticism slips into his explanations and includes more than it uncovers. For instance, a chart including the book. This is a new slide. You can see this, right? Thank you. For instance, a chart included in a book and one of many promises to offer an overview, but this convoluted system of relations among and between individual cards, their attendant symbols, numerals, and relations to Kabbalistic systems of epistemic relations is far from accessible. You need to spend more time with this in order to acquire an intimacy with it. And one of the points I'm trying to make that actually quite a lot of people who might have used the book would not have used it as he wanted it to be used. The tarot then contains within its pages a series of suppressive maneuvers that limit both the book's and the deck's use. This is intentional, this slide. Despite Kurtzahn's discouraging esotericism, the tarot became more widespread and it remained niche. Again, this dynamic, I'd love to talk a little bit about this esotericism popularity dynamic. The book and the deck were included in numerous German and European bibliographies and literary calendars, listing newly published works of interest to the public. Kurtzahn's work was favorably reviewed in newspapers in Germany and Austria and became a central reference for occultists during the Weimar era. I did not notice anything about Warburg, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the potential connection there. In addition to the book, and the deck's publisher issued a second edition in 1925 due to popular demand. By then, two additional books on tarot by, and I mentioned already, Woldemar von Uxkull and August Frank Glan had entered the German market. In a time in which, as Corinna Trantel has shown, I quote, the occult remained deeply compelling to the lay public, end quote. Kurtzahn's De Tarot was able to find eager readers and serve as precursor for additional German language publications on tarot, each with their own conceptualized decks. The queer potentialities of Kurtzahn's approach to tarot register already in early moments in the book in which he is charting a theory of tarot. He begins distilling the intellectual traditions informing his works in an introduction as follows. And I'll list both the German, but I'll read, and the English, but I'll read the English. What is the human? The human's visible components are an accumulation of material practices, and the invisible ones are constituted by a sum of forces. Let us call these cosmic influences. And so he insists on this idea of Kräfte or forces, which for Kurtzahn foregrounds influence that kind of like informs all aspects of life on Earth. They shape relations and inform patterns of living that reach from before the birth of an individual through the present and into the future. Perceived time and mystical time differ here a bit. According to the doctrine Kurtzahn advances, all life is already determined by this cosmic force in some fashion. What tarot permits its practitioners to apprehend is to apprehend this force, study its effects, and consider not how an individual can depart from a path on which they are, but how they can make the most of their time on a given path on which they were placed. However, the system to which he hopes to introduce his readers is too complex to be acquired through a simple transmission. By Kurtzahn's own admission, his text might be able to provide his readers with all they need to know about the Technik des Tarots, or the system of tarot. But because of the, and I'll quote here, oft verwickelten und sehr schwierigen Symbolik, what he calls the frequently complicated and very challenging symbolism, he can only provide his readers with instructions that serve as tools towards understanding the practice. The rest of the work required toward a full accomplishment of the practice of the occult, readers would have to undertake on their own. This work is primarily qualified by extensive engagement with the cards, repetition, consultation of Kurtzahn's writing, practice in private and also with others would provide tarot enthusiasts with a requisite experience towards a more refined practice. But despite the guiding Kurtzahn offers his readers, and even despite the insistence that tarot's deepest secrets, I'm quoting him here, deepest secrets really cannot be simplified even if one wanted to do so, the gesture of asking readers to practice on their own time encourages a type of intimacy between readers and cards that departs from the intended use of the deck. Given that the human being is, according to Kurtzahn, a construct of cosmic universal forces that manifest themselves through radiation, and given that the tarot cards can provide a key with which to access the vast knowledge encoded in this broader cosmic network of forces, the reader gives themselves over to tarot's visual symbolic order for guidance. Here, each card is a whole universe with its interlinked gradations of life, steady and personal engagement with which permits the reader to glean the universe's force field. Apprehending visual signs is then not just a hermeneutic operation located at an interaction between a reading subject and a card containing information, but rather between a reading subject and a card that becomes a gate through which one might gather information that reaches far beyond what had been contained in the symbolic order of the card to begin with. The unstable visual sign of tarot can suppress any meaning Kurtzahn prescribed in the book. Take, for instance, Kurtzahn's entry for Die Lieben, and here I brought a couple of supported images, and you'll notice very similar iconography to some of the cards you've seen in the previous presentations. Take, for instance, Kurtzahn's entry for The Lovers, which is the 6th card in a deck. As with the High Priestess and all other cards in the deck, the imagery pertains to crude iconography. A male figure at the center is flanked by 2 female figures. A cherub flies above the scene and has an arrow drawn and ready to be shot. The facial expression of the figures is somewhat obscured, but at least 2 figures on the right side of the frame seem to express astonishment, as all 3 seem to be drawn closer to one another. The entry for the card, much like all others, offers a description of the card's visual material alongside its image and provides relevant information that helps position it in a system of divination advanced in the book. I quote here, "The card is a symbol of unity, but also of conflict and polarity. The opportunity and the suppression of action both find expression in the card. The contradictory force here serves as a means by which to stimulate thought in a reader. Is it one or is it the other? How does this pan out with regard to the question asked of the cards? How does this relate to the subject matter about which a given reading is supposed to provide additional information? In opening up a couple of paths that can be pursued, the card prompts readers to use their own insight in order to weigh up what is the most applicable scenario." As Kurtzahn's narrative continues, he calls further attention to the illustration of the card. The figure of a young man stands at a crossroads. The polarity mentioned here in the text finds repeated expression by way of calling attention to the potentially distraught figure at the heart of the card captured in the facial expression. As the entry unfolds, the dualism and nebulous struggle find repeated expression. I quote him, "Through this profound symbol, which is often misunderstood, it is shown that the man who steadfastly chooses the good, the path of virtue, does not remain without support, and Providence will unite with his will for good to help him overcome vice." End quote. The card's symbolic order instantiates the nebulous duality mentioned. The male figure is caught between two possible paths. A good one and a bad one is captured in the two figures on either side of him. But what precisely this path means for the reader depends on the reader and not Kurtzahn's prescriptivism. Here, the reader is likely to supply information that reaches beyond what Kurtzahn's short entry might inspire. The visual symbolic order of the triad is capacious enough to hold space for many different interpretations. The card's visual symbolic order does not offer an answer to the issues raised by the tension among the figure, nor do its visual regimes mark one figure a problem and another not. Instead, the open-endedness of the visual order encoded in the card stimulates reflection, gives rise to wonder, and leads to a highly personalized experience of reading that never simply serves Kurtzahn's intellectual project of maintaining a tidy purity for tarot's uses. In other words, the visual symbolic order depends on individualization that renders its meanings always already flexible. Of interest is the fact that Kurtzahn made available Of interest is the fact that the cards Kurtzahn made available for use were a major feature of the book. While his theoretical part served as introduction, the card's use itself was vital for the work he undertook. This means that the visual order of the cards becomes a major means by which a tarot practitioner would interact with them. This order could trigger the reader's memory about a card's meaning articulated in a book, or it could trigger some other associations based on the visual information encoded in each card. In so doing, the use of the cards transpires not exclusively by a recourse to Kurtzahn's system, even if the book can serve as reference for interpretation. At one point, a reader's intimacy with the cards would help them pursue readings on the basis of that knowledge alone, rendering Kurtzahn's book secondary to the interpretive work at hand. Moreover, because an image on a given card can immediately pertain to the lived experience of the reader precisely because of the allegorical nature of its symbols, it can function via recourse to various insights. Exactly because tarot is not empirically oriented, in that it does not operate via recourse to realism, the allegory of the card becomes a surface on which to start reconciling one's lived experience with the abstraction as encoded in crude symbols. This generosity of the cards permits many to see themselves reflected in them. The cards indeed invite others to participate regardless of experience and point of interest. In other words, the cards are primed for queer use and for departure from Kurtzahn's rigid system. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Kurtzahn repeatedly warns his readers that card symbols can be very dangerous. Kurtzahn thus foregrounds what he calls Irrwege, or like wrong paths for tarot reading. Such admission points further to the queer potentiality at the core of the deck, whereby the interaction with tarot gives rise to radical fabulation that could depart from intentioned readings. In the realm of giving oneself over to the system, Kurtzahn advances, but then relishing in the wonder that is a symbolic order made available to account for many different experiences in ways not structured by the epistemic systems of the status quo. A tarot reader can get lost and thereby find comfort in knowledge produced through queer tarot uses. This generative operational practice of tarot's visual symbolic orders were able to serve different people in different ways, and this includes queer people seeking language and structure by which to explain how they relate to a sometimes supportive and at other times very hostile world during the Weimar era.